Then Zophar the Naamathite replied, "My troubled thoughts prompt me to answer because I am greatly disturbed. I hear a rebuke that dishonors me, and my understanding inspires me to reply. Surely you know how it has been from of old, ever since mankind was placed on the earth, that the mirth of the wicked is brief. The joy of the godless lasts but a moment. Though the pride of the godless person reaches to the heavens, and his head touches the clouds, he will perish forever, like his own dung. Those who have seen him will say, 'Where is he?' Like a dream he flies away, no more to be found, vanished like a vision of the night. The eye that saw him will not see him again. His place will look on him no more. His children must make amends to the poor. His own hands must give back his wealth. The youthful vigor that fills his bones will lie with him in the dust. Though evil is sweet in his mouth, and he hides it under his tongue, though he cannot bear to let it go and lets it linger in his mouth, yet his food will turn sour in his stomach. It will become the venom of the serpents within him. He will spit out the riches he swallowed. God will make his stomach vomit them up. He will suck the poison of serpents. The fangs of an adder will kill him. He will not enjoy the streams, the rivers flowing with honey and cream. What he toiled for, he must give back uneaten. He will not enjoy the profit from his trading, for he has oppressed the poor and left them destitute. He has seized houses he did not build. Surely he will have no respite from his craving. He cannot save himself by his treasure. Nothing is left for him to devour. His prosperity will not endure. In the midst of his plenty, distress will overtake him. The full force of misery will come upon him. When he has filled his belly, God will vent his burning anger against him and rain down his blows on him. Though he flees from an iron weapon, a bronze-tipped arrow pierces him. He pulls it out of his back, the gleaming point out of his liver. Terrors will come over him. Total darkness lies in wait for his treasures. A fire unfanned will consume him and devour what is left in his tent. The heavens will expose his guilt. The earth will rise up against him. A flood will carry off his house, rushing waters on the day of God's wrath. Such is the fate God allots the wicked, the heritage appointed for them by God. May the Lord bless the reading of his word. God, my mouth, I speak the message that I prepared, that it be his message, not my message. That his will might be done, not mine. That he might receive glory and honor, not I. And all those with ears might hear the words of the Lord. Amen. Amen. My sermon this morning is entitled The Oldest Job in History. When we read from the book of Job, we are reading what is linguistically and theologically the oldest book of the Bible. It's from the oldest sources. It asks the oldest, most basic question in human experience. The question that every parent of a 3-year-old knows. Why? More specifically, the question is, why is this happening to me? And so Job starts off with this description of this man who lives in the land of Uz. We don't know where that is. We just know that it isn't Israel. And we have this description of his life and how it's going so well. And then calamity comes. The story is God releases Satan, the adversary, the accuser. And Satan strikes Job with all these calamities. His kids die, his wealth goes away, his health goes away, all these problems. And what's interesting is that it seems like the authorship and the setting, like I said, it says the land of Uz, but we don't know where that is. It may be, at the end of it, if it's not the end of the world, then you can see it from there. It's just, someplace. We also don't know who wrote the book. There's nowhere that it's penned, and probably it's not Job. And it seems as if the author is doing this in order for us not to get hung up in sort of historical questions, but to look at what is going on in the text. Now, what gets challenging is that what the text is, most of it, is not a story, but most of it is like chapter 20 that we read. It's Hebrew poetry. It's ancient Hebrew poetry. And this is the way, in the ancient world, and to some degree today, this is a way of dealing with sort of philosophical questions. Rather than trying to, because this isn't what happened next? This is a why, a what for, sort of thing. In some ways, it's like when Robert Frost is talking about stone walls. He's talking about a lot more than stone walls. He's talking about those things that separate one human being from another human being. When Kenny Rogers sings The Gambler, I know I got blank stares with Robert Frost. He's from New Hampshire. But when Kenny Rogers sings The Gambler, the truth of that song is not tied up in the historicity that Kenny was ever on a train late one night and met some guy who gave him some words of advice, an ace that he could hold to. No, there's more going on than just the details of the story. It's a way of getting at a deeper truth. And so we read this, and we read the story of Job's downfalls, and we know people who have lived that sort of life. We know people who have just experienced one calamity after another, and who have asked God the very same question, why? We see in the book of Job that he has all these problems, and the bulk of the book of Job is not talking about all his problems, but talking about how he responds, what he actually says, oh, woe is me. And his three friends, in quotes, who come to him and their response. And what's interesting about the three friends' responses, again, it's up to interpretation as to whether or not there were actually three people who came and said these specific things. But what they say are exactly the sorts of things that you hear when bad things happen. They're exactly the sort of things that sometimes we're actually guilty of speaking into somebody's life. Oh, well, you must have done this thing or that thing. Think about when you have a calamity or a tragedy or an atrocity happen in the news, and then you get some preachers who go out and say, oh, it's because of this sin or that sin, or this is why, this is God's divine wrath. Oh, thanks. I mean, we can be stupid Christians too. It's not limited to pastors, right? Somebody has some problem going on in their life, and you've seen the sort of downward spiral descent that their life has been taking, and you decide that when they hit rock bottom is exactly the moment you go and visit them and say, well, see, I told you. If you hadn't been doing all this stupid stuff that I've been asking you about for the past however many years, you wouldn't be in the place you are now. Oh, thanks. What's interesting is that these three friends who have a response, this is what, much of the ancient world, much of other world's religions, these are the answers you get. Because the human experience, with all its joys and tragedies and challenges and such, the human experience is common throughout the world and throughout time. I mean, think about it for a second. We're reading a book this morning. This section of the book is about 4,000 years old. And yet, like I said, we know people who live this exact thing. We are people who have lived this exact thing, whether it's the friends or Job. And so, 4,000 years ago, the human experience wasn't particularly different. Yeah, they didn't have Facebook. They didn't have cars. They didn't have microwave dinners. But the challenges of life were the same. the joys of life through these things. And so when we read the book of Job, we see the biblical take on those things, and we see the folly in some of the other answers that we can get in other places. Because every human being is trying to answer that question that Rabbi Kushner so lovely worded: why do bad things happen to good people? Although more importantly, we're not really concerned about that. We want to know, why do bad things happen to me? Because I'm a good person, right? We only slightly care about other people. And so you get two main answers in the book of Job. First, you get one from Job, which is saying basically, listen, I haven't done anything to deserve this, and so therefore the world is not just. The world is unfair. And when you take that to its extreme, what you get is, and therefore the guy who started this whole unfair world off, who set this whole game up, must have been unfair. God himself is unjust and unfair for starting this world. And let me tell you, I know a lot of people, and sometimes I've been the person who, when suffering through the challenges and the agony and the pain of this life, get to that point and we go, God, I'm done with you. You are not a fair God. You are not just. You have set up a crooked game. I'm not going to play anymore. We see that response in Job. His friends are slightly more pious, and they respond that, no, God is just, the world is just, but you, Job, are a jerk. You have somehow done something to receive this punishment. You deserve it. That's the response that we see in many of the world's religions. This is the teaching that we see in Hinduism. And if you look at somebody that they're suffering as well, it's because that they've somehow done something in their life that they deserve that suffering. And if you look at their entire life and say, oh, well, their entire life was perfect, well, it isn't this life, it was the previous life, or the previous life, or the previous life. For 10,000 years, somehow, they are living out a suffering because of what they've done. The challenge with that worldview, if you believe that, is that the only bad thing that will accumulate in your life is more suffering and more evil. And it just builds and builds and builds and builds and builds, and you cannot get off that crushing wheel. It's the worldview that Islam and other legalistic religions, when people say, oh, well, if you do these particular things, if you have a works righteousness, if you do these things, then you will succeed and you will be blessed. But so therefore, if you are not blessed, if you are suffering, if you are cursed, well, then somehow, somewhere, you did something wrong. And again, you cannot escape the weight of law, the weight of legalism, the weight of works. And so all that will ever add up in your life is all those mistakes. Because once you've made one, and then you make two, and then you make three, and there's no way to get rid of those things. Like I said, it's the predominant worldview in Islam, but quite frankly, it's a predominant worldview throughout much of Christianity, both today and historically. That, oh, you have to do these particular things if you're going to be a good person, if you're going to be right with God. And if you're right with God, you'll be blessed. Because you're doing these things. But we know we never quite always do right. It's a challenge. There is another friend who comes in and he does explain something. His name's Elihu, and he has a slightly different argument. What's interesting is Job refutes all of these, the three friends, when they're going on about how bad he is. He goes, no, they're wrong. Elihu comes in and proposes another idea, basically that God somehow uses injustice and unfairness to build character in an individual, to somehow improve the world through that suffering, through that challenge. And what's interesting is that, excuse me, that it doesn't, Job doesn't address that and say, oh no, that's not quite right. It seems like, well, that may be true, but it's still not helpful to Job. And again, think about your own life when you've suffered, when you've been in a place of despair, challenge, and some well-meaning Christian, quotes Joseph to you. Well, so-and-so meant it for evil, but God means it for good. Well, that may be true, but it's not particularly helpful when you're in the midst of that challenge. Maybe just easier to ignore it than Job does. Now, I've just given you a quick run through of the book of Job. If you're wanting more, here I'm giving you my bibliography. I'm going to have Amanda post a video from the Bible Project. It's 11 and a half minutes summarizing the entire book of Job. And it's got pictures and stuff, so it's fun and it's good and it's useful. I'll put it on a Facebook page with the sermon so you can watch it and go, oh, yeah, I think I understand. But Zophar here in chapter 20 is in the middle of explaining how the wicked are paid back for what they're done. He's basically laying out the case for karma. Right? He's saying, oh no, although they've got the evil under their tongue and it's sweet in their mouth, later on they vomit. Remember I said this is poetry? I know it sounds more like Bean's poetry than Robert Frost. But it's using these images and these concepts to explain something. Now, quite frankly, Zophar sounds a lot like the Psalms. There are a lot of Psalms that sound like this. Oh, the wicked will be repaid. Right? In Psalm 1, not so the wicked. They are like the chaff that the wind blows away. Contrasting the righteous man who is like the tree planted by the waters, not so the wicked. They go away. Plenty of times in the Psalms, there's the championing of this idea that, no, wicked people flourish for a while, but then they're like grass and tossed away. We know that that's sometimes true. Sometimes the world does work that way, and we see someone get their comeuppance. We see someone get paid back. We see someone's house of cards that they built that looks so glorious come tumbling down. But too often or not, the wicked get away with it. And they prosper. Too often the wicked live terrible lives, godless lives, mocking God. And they just get wealthier than is possibly imaginable. They marry supermodels. They run for president, might win. It's a challenge to our sense of what's good and decent in the world. We look at it and go, no, this is not right. Zophar's wrong. So then what do we do? We read this book of Job. There's a couple of things that come to us. One of them, and this is one of the lessons that the rabbis have. The first thing you should learn from the book of Job is how not to address suffering in somebody else's life. How not to go into a house of mourning and just, you must have deserved this. The rabbis say that from the book of Job, that when you go to a house of mourning, you go and you sit down and you say nothing. It's interesting to me. Again, I probably go to more houses of mourning than some folks. But it's interesting to me how uncomfortable people are with suffering. And so they sometimes will just babble constantly in order to somehow speak their way out of their uncomfortableness. Instead of just being there and saying, yeah, this is awful. Because there's really nothing you can say in those situations to fix it. There's nothing you can say to somehow explain it, to make it good or comfortable. And so the first thing we learn from this is don't be Zophar. Or Bildad, or Gandalf, or whatever the guys' names are. Just go and be alongside somebody. Don't point out how bad somebody is in order to justify their pain. Just go. Be alongside them. The second thing we can take away from this is we should recognize that there is some truth in what Zophar says, and know that success built on wrong living is not permanent. You know, it's like playing King of the Mountain. You ever remember playing King of the Mountain, with snow or a grassy hill or something? It's like playing King of the Mountain on a manure pile. Yeah, you might be successful for a while. You might be the king up there, up high, but you're in the manure pile. Yeah, you can really succeed an awful lot in this world. You can have houses and buildings and lands named after you. Again, that's what the Psalms said. But after a while, you'll just fade away like everybody else. You know, quick, 200 years ago, who was the 5th richest person in the United States? I don't know. They probably thought they were doing pretty well. They probably were doing pretty well. Doesn't amount to a hill of beans or something worse. Know that success built on wrong living is never permanent. And the third thing we can do with this text is that we can use our suffering. Remember, there's a difference between addressing someone else's suffering and our suffering. But many times we find ourselves like Job going, why is this happening to me? I've done the things that I'm supposed to do. I've been listen. I go to church every Sunday. I hear Pastor A. What he says, I do. I'm faithful and obedient and godly, and then something bad happens to us, and we go, why me? Why, God? Why is this happening to me? We can use our suffering to identify with Christ. We can use it as a focal point to say, this somehow is making me like Jesus. There's a fourth response in the ancient world that Job doesn't, the book of Job doesn't deal with, and it's the response in Buddhism, which is to say, oh, well, if you're suffering, you're not really suffering, it's not real, it's illusory. That's the same worldview that the Christian scientists have. That somehow, what you're going through, your illness or your financial trouble or something, isn't real. Well, that's not really helpful, because it sure feels real to me. And quite frankly, even if you say, oh, well, this isn't real, is death real? Did Buddha die? Somehow he didn't think his way out of that one, with power of positive thinking. No, we use our suffering because it makes us identify with Jesus. Jesus is God, come down, not removed from the world's sufferings. You see, in every other system of thought and theology, other than the Bible, God and the gods are somehow up here, separated from the struggles and the realities of human life. They live on a completely different plane. Or the top of a mountain someplace up above the clouds, eating ambrosia with its little marshmallows and jello and whatnot. They're up there, and we're down here slugging it out in the mud. But the message of the Bible is, no, the God who is way up here, living where there's the streets are paved with gold, where there is no suffering and no crying and no pain. The God who lives up here comes down to earth to live among us, to be one of us, to suffer and die for us. And so while we may not understand God's perspective, while we may be living our lives and looking out and going, this doesn't make any sense to me, God. God understands our perspective because He came down to this earth as a little baby, was born, raised, suffered, died, and did absolutely nothing wrong. Not one thing to justify. Remember, Jesus' accusers, the Pontius Pilate and the Sanhedrin, they can come up with nothing other than he said that he was God. That's only a sin if you're not God. I was talking to somebody, he said, well, what about when Jesus was on the cross and he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's got to be a sin. No, he was praying Psalm 22. That can't be a sin. God comes down to this earth to show us that He understands our suffering, that He is alongside us. He comes like a person to a house of mourning and says, I can only do so much. I'd like to just take this pain away from you completely, but I can't do that right now. So instead, I'll just be here with a casserole or a bag of ravioli or whatever you bring to a house of mourning, cookies. I've got a little blessing. It doesn't take it away, but it lets you know that I'm here alongside you. And so when we suffer, if we use that suffering to remind us that we share our suffering with Christ, especially if it's because we are following Christ. But even if it's not, even if it's just due to the dungishness of the world, you can't get back at me because it was in the Scriptures, right? So sometimes I get people don't always like my coarse language. That's because they haven't read some of the Scriptures I've read. Scriptures can get a little coarse. Anyway, even if our experience is just because of the fallen, sinful nature of the world, we can use it to remind us that we are bound to Christ Jesus, who suffered that same sinful effect in His life. And by being bound to Him in our sufferings, we will be bound to Him who showed us that He was victorious not only over this life, not only did He live this life perfectly, but He also was victorious over death and will reign eternally and sits at the right hand of the Father now, that we will be bound to Him not only in our sufferings, not only in His sufferings, but in His victory, in His power, in His triumph. And that we can have that in the midst of what we're going through right now, in this life. And we can have it in the life to come. Amen.